Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Madness and Meaning. We are very unsure how this is going to go today, but I'm really excited for this topic. We really wanted to explore the different perspectives of how peace can be accessed. And we are at a time on this planet where there's a lot of upheaval. We're all feeling it. Wherever you look, there's what can be considered to be chaos, instability, infighting, and this sense of unrest. And I think we can all agree that what we would really like, all of us, is to feel a sense of peace within ourselves and amongst each other, and to be able to see it all the world over and to feel a greater sense of calm and stability, because it's something that I don't think we have felt for a very long time as a collective. And Kelly and I were exploring how peace can really be accessed. And we came up with two ways that you can go about feeling at peace. And there is not one that's better than the other, but they are just two different directions that you can take with it that offer different things inside of them. The first one is to focus outwardly on the world around you and to try to change the systems, to try to restructure things so that you can see a more peaceful existence being reflected and lived inside of around you. And when you can live inside of a reality where there seems to be a more peaceful way of living, there's more flow, there's more cooperation, allows you to access more peace internally. And then the flip side of that, another way that you can go about this is to turn inwards and try to see yourself and the world around you through a different lens that offers you a feeling of peace, regardless of what's happening outside of you. And that is possible to do. And so we were exploring these two different, seemingly contrasting approaches to accessing peace. And I thought it would be a really fascinating conversation to explore each one in turn, what the pros and cons are to each one, the limitations inside of each one, and the potential for expansion inside of each one individually. And so I just to throw it to Kelly, is there something that stands out to you right away in terms of the direction you want to start with this?
Yeah, well, I think giving some examples around what each strategy can look like and like different terminology that we use to describe that process. And I don't know if I'm getting this right. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but to me, like the spiritual perspective around the problems that are happening in the world right now and all the time is one that it tends to be trying to put some kind of purpose behind the negativity that's happening. Like, as an example, all of this negativity, all the wars, all of the abuse and the darkness that's coming to light that we're becoming more and more and more blatantly aware of every single day that happens in the world. It's becoming larger and harder to ignore because it's coming up to leave, or because we're purging it, or because the world is ascending and we're moving up in vibration, and all of this negativity that was easier to ignore before, or behind the scenes, or was like hidden more so, had to come forward. We had to be able to see it and face it and force it and have it be everywhere that we look in order for it to come up and to move away. And I think that and that's like one very weird way of describing that perspective. Obviously, people have their own unique ways of looking at what's going on in that through that same or similar perspective. But I think that that kind of lends itself to more of the inside approach to it, where it's like you're looking at what's going on and you're attaching a different meaning to it, or you're telling yourself a different story about it to try to access more peace internally. And I think that's what a lot of people in the spiritual community are doing. One part being because, and you mentioned this when we were talking about it, if a lot of the spiritual, very empathetic and sensitive people on earth didn't have a way of looking at what's going on in a positive or purposeful way, we would all just have an absolute fucking crises.
Which on
Which
some
we're doing
level is
anyway.
happening anyway.
It's happening anyway, but at
Yeah.
least like we can have moments of solace where it's like, well, maybe this is happening for a reason.
Yeah.
And maybe I get to be here during this time because I'm supposed to help.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But that's so interesting that you're labeling that as the internal process.
Right, because that's where I was like, I don't know if it is, because I know that it could be viewed the other way.
That's so interesting. So this might be a really interesting place to start. We can label this through the term ascension, which I think is what you're getting at, which is a
Hmm.
term thrown around in the spiritual space that sort of lends itself to this future potential of a Garden of Eden on the planet Earth, where we are living in harmony, we are living in a sense of peace amongst one another, and a sense of connection to ourselves and what's greater than us. And as we get closer and closer to that outcome, we as individuals are increasing in our vibration from a third dimensional reality to a fifth dimensional reality, and eventually leaving this earth life altogether and moving on to a different existence. And to me, that takes on the paradigm of a very externally focused perspective, where
Mm.
we have to change how we're all operating and how we are, yes, seeing one another, but there seems to be, just from my vantage point, and maybe that's the clarity that's missing inside of the ascension conversation. It just seems to be like this this narrative of I have to show others how, so that we can all be different. And in being differently with one another, we will change the world externally.
Hmm.
And I think that what gets lost is the other side of things, where how do you be different? It's an inside job to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at is the reason why the concept of ascension or the desire to ascend can be labeled as an outs, like it's in that category of we're making it an outside job, is that because we're saying I cannot feel okay
Yes.
until that happens, until that change externally happens. But I think where my mind was taking it is also like, I think in the spiritual world where people are aware of this concept of ascension and wanting to contribute to it, we have usually this understanding that part of helping the world externally change is an inside job. Like the work that we're meant to do isn't like going out there and advocating as much as it is like doing our own work, looking at our own shadows, feeling love, sending love, like, just trying to be more inside of our, trying to raise our own vibration, basically, as a to in strategy to raise the vibration of the planet, which is technically an inside job,
Hmm.
but I don't think it's actually practiced that way a lot of the time.
It's an inside job with an external focus,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
Hmm.
And something else to notice is, when it is an inside job, the way towards feeling more levity inside of oneself is to find the levity inside of what you were previously labeling as heaviness. And in order to feel the levity inside of the heaviness, you have to be able to experience the heaviness differently. So you're not making the heaviness go away, we're changing it. And
Hmm.
wouldn't the same go for our external reality? Witnessing what you were perceiving to be heaviness and experiencing it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Which people listening to this might end up trying to think of like, okay, well, how do I experience
Right.
abuse, war, like like so much terrible darkness and trauma that's happening in the world right now differently? How do I experience that with levity?
So my answer to that is twofold. There is the soul perspective and there is the human perspective. From the human perspective, it's very, very challenging. It's very challenging. How can you sit and look at people committing crimes against each other and see any of that as a way to access place of peace? Unless you can say, well, they're doing the best with the tools that they have, and so they just don't know how else to be. But that still doesn't really provide a lot of relief.
I think that compassionate perspective, I don't want to undervalue it at the same time because I, my personal experience I'll speak to is that I have practiced having a compassionate lens over the last several years to where I think I see a lot of the world through a compassionate perspective, or I can get myself there intentionally. And I see that in contrast to how the majority of people tend to see the world, in how they speak about it and how they bring certain things up and that's happening in the world. And I can feel the weight that they're carrying about it in comparison to how I hold it and how it feels for me to hold it. And it doesn't mean that it's still easy to hold or that it's not hard to hold it because the darkness is inherently going to feel challenging. It's dark, it's heavy for a reason. It, and I don't want this to come across as naivety either because I think that even sometimes myself I start to think like am I just not feeling as affected by the events of the world because I'm trying to naively convince myself that it's okay. But I think that compassionate perspective and being able to see, you know, people that are doing bad things aren't bad people, as an example.
I think some people would disagree. And I
Right.
think, yeah,
And that's that causes a lot of suffering for them
right.
to hold
Yeah.
it that way. And I and I don't know for sure because I can't I know from my own personal experience of seeing it that way before in the past and now seeing it this way that experiencing life this way is much easier. It's much lighter,
Why might someone resist that perspective?
probably because they think that they won't be productive at changing it if that's the perspective they hold. I think a lot of people hold on to their pain and the perspectives and the way of experiencing things that causes them pain because they think that's the only way that they can create change.
Or there's guilt, right?
Yeah,
Like, who am I to feel at peace when there's so much suffering elsewhere?
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you. I used to hold that perspective too of like everyone's horrible
Hmm.
and everyone's the worst
People are
and
bad.
people are bad, people are stupid. And man, did I feel very lost and scared
Hmm.
inside of that way of seeing the world and myself to the point where I almost checked out of it.
Yeah.
I couldn't take it anymore. And I have learned through working with you and through this more spiritual perspective that I have really begun to resonate with a more compassionate lens to see the behavior that I'm witnessing through a very different lens. When you can see someone causing pain to another, you can say that's a horrible person and that's a very wrong and bad thing to do. And let's not focus on the action itself. Let's focus on the intention behind the action, because we can all agree that there is action that is really just wrong.
Yeah.
So let's put that aside for a moment and focus on the intention behind the action. And I used to say, well, the intention is to hurt that person because they're a bad person. That's why they're doing what they're doing. And I no longer see it that way. I
Yeah.
see the intention be behind the action of searching for a way to feel at peace.
They're trying to protect themselves. They're trying to have control or power
Right.
because they're so scared and don't feel safe internally. They're trying to find a sense of significance
Ultimately,
sometimes.
they're trying to feel at peace through all of
Yeah.
those different lenses, right?
Yeah.
And this is just the only way they know how.
That's
So
right.
they're essentially trying to do the same thing I'm trying to do, but they have different tools than I do
Hmm.
to be able to access what they're searching for. And
Yeah.
who am I to judge that when they weren't
Mm.
given the same deck of cards that I was handed? They're on their path. And if I'm judging their path, it's because I probably don't know them that well and I don't know what they've been through.
Hmm.
And so that's how I'm seeing it now. Is there anything else you want to add around that?
I just wanted to give like the like adjacent point that I think helped me really land into this perspective is that, and I think Alyssa Nobriga says this, that anger isn't bad, it's violence that is. But we tend to group the two together. We tend to
Right.
think that like anger is bad, an angry person is bad, but anger is just an emotion, it's just energy. It's what we do with it that can
Right.
cause problems or that can be justified as wrong. And I think that we can take that more grander scale into what we're speaking about, which is that human humans are not bad. And I think every intention that a human has is, if we peel the layers back enough, and this is even getting into, I can hear people like starting to think, well, there's narcissistic people, right? They have bad intentions. But even with them, I think that their intention is still to protect themselves.
Exactly.
There's a lot of narrative from psychologists saying that people with narcissistic personality disorder just have a lot of shame. And that's the
Yeah.
only way they know how to deal with their shame is through that power dynamic and putting people down and abuse and all of that that comes with narcissistic personality disorder. And if their intention behind treating people that way and their behaviors is to avoid their shame, again, their intention is to find peace within themselves.
Right.
Like you're saying, we peel the layers back enough, there's always a good intention behind every behavior. But it's just that, like you said, some people were dealt decks of cards where they don't know that they have access to other behaviors or they don't have access to other behaviors to achieve that intention in a less harmful way.
Or you know, they're reliving a pattern that they experienced growing up. And like it's happening so unconsciously that they don't have, again, the tools to know, to recognize that and to do something about it. They're just living it, and I guess not recognizing what's really happening there. And then there's the spiritual perspective, which can be problematic if you're not willing to hold it through that same compassionate lens, where you can say, well, we've all come here to experience all of it. And when someone is experiencing pain and suffering and abuse and neglect, that was part of what they chose inside of this experience. And who am I to dictate whether or not that's right or wrong? And that's a very challenging perspective to buy into. And I still struggle with that through the lens of animal abuse. I just, I don't have the tolerance for that,
Yeah.
despite knowing that there's another perspective available to me. And so I don't think that there is a right or wrong. It just, I guess it just depends on how are you willing to experience your reality and how are you wanting to change it.
And I think it's a big point to recognize and to pull out that it's a conscious choice for you to hold on to the perspective that you have around animal abuse. Like you're not just unconsciously asleep inside of this perspective about it that causes you suffering, not knowing that you're choosing it. Like you just said, you have an awareness that there's other perspectives that you could hold. And because you're aware of it, but still holding on to this one, it's because that's what resonates. That's what feels like it serves you right now. And I think that that's the point I want to put across is that it's not the perspective that you take, but it's that you're consciously choosing which ones you take.
How would you guide someone to begin to consciously recognize the perspective that they're holding and see that there is room for them to shift it and
Hmm.
also recognizing that there's resistance in doing so?
Okay, let's do it. Let's come up with an example. What is some like what is a something that we're having a perspective on that we can use as an example? Like is it something that's going on in the world right now? Is it something that's going on in someone's personal life? Come up with an example
I mean,
of
can we
someone that
use
could be listening.
Ascension as the example? Does that fit?
Um,
Like if
uh,
someone is seeing the world around them as a reality that reflects that we haven't descended yet, because there's so much wrongness, there's so much suffering, there's so much pain, and we have to do something about it to change it so that we can finally feel peace inside of Ascension.
yeah. So like the state of the world in comparison to where you think it could be
Hmm.
is really what we're talking about. So I'm going to ask some questions that I want you to answer them based on how you some example answers that you think people might have.
Okay.
So when you think about the state of the world and where it's at in comparison to where you think it could be, how does that make you feel?
Hopeless, horrible, like I don't have a voice, like I don't have the power to change anything. And also frustrated that we still haven't gotten our shit together.
Yeah. So what would you have to be thinking and believing about the state of the world in order to feel hopeless about it?
That what I'm witnessing is the worst case scenario compared to what it could be. What it could be is better than what it is essentially what I mean.
Yeah.
That we don't have the ability to change it right now. I don't have the ability to change it, or we're not willing as a collective to change it.
Yeah. What would you have to be thinking and believing about the state of the world in order to feel frustrated?
Um, that my voice doesn't matter, that my knowing better isn't being seen and heard, and that people need to wake up to the real problem that's going on, which is that they're focusing their attention on the disruption rather than the peace that we could all be experiencing.
Yeah. So just to give a recap of the process so far, whatever we're trying to pull out what someone's perspective is on something so that we can give them an opportunity to change it. And so first we look at how do they feel about the thing that we're trying to figure out what their perspective is on it. So asking how they feel, and then we get the perspective or the beliefs, the stories that they're telling themselves about it by asking, what would you have to be thinking and believing about that thing in order to feel that way? So we have the feeling identified, and then what would you have to be thinking and believing in order to feel that way? And so this person that I'm interviewing, aka Amanda's perspective on the world is that what's happening right now is worst case scenario. Um, what could be in the world is better than what currently is. We don't have the ability to change it. I don't have the ability to change it. We aren't willing to change it. My voice doesn't matter. My voice isn't being seen and heard or taken seriously. And people need to wake up to what's going on. So, that perspective or those perspectives about the world are probably quite resonant with a lot of people. I think a lot of people are going to hold those same beliefs or tell themselves those same stories about the world. And so, the opportunity that we have here now is to look at each of those statements and just inquire whether they're true and actively seek out evidence to support what could be the opposite of that statement. So, as an example, um, what I am witnessing is the worst case scenario. If we were to flip that and try on different ways of saying the opposite of that, we could say, what I'm witnessing isn't worst case scenario. What I'm witnessing is best case scenario. And all those might sound very silly. I would invite someone to try those on and see how could those be true.
Can we explore that really quickly to give
Yeah,
some examples of how it actually could be true?
right. So, how could it be true, or just as true as the other statement, that what we're witnessing in the world right now is best case scenario?
Well, what we're witnessing in the world looks like chaos on the outside, but if everything is a projection, then what I'm witnessing as chaos is just a reflection of the chaos I'm feeling inside. And I have a lot of power to change that. And so
Hmm.
all of a sudden, I go from feeling powerless to quite powerful.
Yeah.
And it
And
is,
that perspective offers you the ability to see that there's a positive meaning to what's going on. When
yeah,
it's worst case scenario, it's a negative meaning. There's no purpose behind it. Like it's wrong, it shouldn't be happening. Versus this new perspective, it's best case scenario because even though it's chaotic, it's showing me what exists inside of me. And by showing me what exists inside of me, I can see that I have the power to change it. That's giving it positive meaning.
the world is showing me my ascension process.
Yeah. And that's a different perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah. Let's do one more.
Yeah.
Um, we aren't willing to change, or the world isn't willing to change. We
So
could flip that. We are willing to change. The world is willing to change.
well,
How is that true?
I would say that the chaos we're witnessing is a direct reflection of that being true. Is that there's so much conflict because people are fighting back wanting change. And that
Good
is
point.
ultimately the goal in the chaos we're seeing is to create change. And the
Mm-hmm.
more people speak up about their dissatisfaction with the system means that there's more desire for change and potentially more of a drive to create it and momentum to create it.
Yeah. And I see like how I experience what you just described is just like literally opening your eyes to a new perspective. Because without our eyes open to the perspective that people are willing to change, we're looking at the same thing. We're looking at what's happening in the world, the chaos, what's being revealed, the people fighting, blah, 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 blah. But our eyes are closed to the fact that they're doing that because they want change or because they're willing to change. We're seeing it as, look, people aren't changing, but we're looking at the same thing.
May I put forward a reflection
Yeah.
that I'm seeing inside of this very exercise?
Mm-hmm.
We come here as spiritual beings with the goal of learning and growing through our experiences. And if learning and growing requires challenge in order to achieve, then witnessing chaos and being willing to see it through a new lens is in and of itself what you're coming here for, what you're being given as a gift inside of the experience you're having, and is ascension in and of itself, because ascension is change. You have to experience change in order to shift something within you, which is, I mean, ascension is a shift in frequency. It's a change in how do you shift frequency? Let's get into the minutia of it. You shift your frequency by changing your perspective of you. Through changing your perspective of you, you change your experience of you. By changing your experience of you, you're feeling differently inside of you. Your vibration is different within you. That's all change. And that all happens through the willingness of seeing yourself in the world through a new lens.
Mhm.
So, ascension is achieved through witnessing chaos and no longer seeing it as chaos. And you can't get there without the chaos being present. So,
Not
chaos,
seeing it as chaos as a judgment, because we can see chaos as
right.
chaos, but if we're saying in our minds chaos is a problem, then that's where the judgment comes in, versus like a neutrality around like chaos as a noun
Well,
versus
it's
an
no longer
adjective.
seeing it that way,
Yeah.
right? Like, no longer even seeing chaos,
Mm,
just looks completely different.
yeah.
Technically, you could see the chaos around you as each person trying to access their own inner peace.
Hmm.
And in that
And
way,
struggling to.
and struggling too, but essentially what they're doing is they're trying to ascend. So, where we're witnessing chaos in the world and labeling it as we haven't ascended yet, and this is standing on our way of getting there, what if what you're witnessing is the very process of ascension taking place?
Hmm. Yeah. I love this idea that ascension is learning to love you. You said this earlier, and I want to expand on that because coming back to that idea that people are trying to find peace, or that one path to peace is found externally, a lot of people are trying to create change outside of them, trying to raise the vibration of the planet, not focused on raising their own vibration first. But that's the only thing that we can fully control. And I think that one way that we do that is through changing our perspectives around what's going on outside of us. But a way to do that even more elevated is looking at what we're seeing on the outside that we don't like, that we wish was different, is mirroring something inside of us that we don't like and that we wish was different. And then being willing to give ourselves the love that we know the outside needs in order to change. And I think that's what this ascension process for me has, that's what ascension feels like to me, is learning how to see the world inside of me, see how everything that I see out in the world is a reflection of something in me, and that my only purpose here is to see it and not judge it.
Well, I think that lends itself to how the process of ascension is full of judgment through the lens of how we've been looking at it,
Yeah.
right? Because when you're seeing that we haven't gotten there yet and the state of the world is a problem, that's a complete judgment.
Right.
And that's actually a form of resistance to your own ascension.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
so, in order to shift that, you would have to be okay with what you're witnessing outside of you.
Mm. Which again comes from being willing to upgrade your perspective on it, because when you have a different perspective on it, you experience it differently and then you feel differently inside of yourself.
Yeah. Ascension is not a destination, it's a state of being. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's sort of the conclusion that I've come to. And it's available now. It's not some future potential that we haven't gotten to yet. each person's idea of what ascension feels like is also different. Like for me, it might look and feel differently than it does for you. And so we're all living out our own different reality through our own different perspective of ourself inside of it. And so it's really hard to say we haven't gotten there yet when each of us is going to be arriving at a different destination anyway, right?
Yeah.
And so it really is the journey of one of you. Like to ascend as a collective would mean that we've all reached our own state of ascension individually and feel like we have
Yeah.
arrived.
I like that perspective because then it is inviting us to prioritize our own work. And that doesn't have to be perceived in a selfish way or that we're being naive or that we're turning a blind eye to what's going on out in the world or that we should be out there doing things. And by all means, like be out there doing things
Right.
if that calls to you, like advocate, help, donate, like protect other people, do what you can to create change in the world. But that can't be the only thing that you're doing. Well, it can be.
It can't, it's the
It very
choice,
well
right?
can be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If that's going to allow you to access how you want to feel, then that is the choice that you're making. And you can make
Right.
it consciously or unconsciously,
Yeah.
which I think is what this comes down to. But there's also this other option. And could pairing the two together be the ultimate path towards ascension? Probably.
Yeah. I mean, when you've done that work to bring more love to the parts of yourself that you were judging in yourself and out in the world, frees up a lot of your energy. You feel more expanded, you feel lighter, you want to be out there in service in the world. And so I think I'd like to point that out as like a byproduct to doing the inner work and making that your number one focus, your number one priority. It doesn't mean that you're not out there supporting the world and supporting humanity and helping create the changes that we are aware we would like to see changed. We can do all of that, and we're going to do it so much better and so much more productively, in my opinion. But I think my opinion is grounded on some pretty understandable things that it's going to be a lot easier for us to show up and create that change and have it be productive change when we are approaching it from an ascended place inside of ourselves. And let me reword that, not an ascended place, but an ascending place when we're in process of ascending.
I would love to quickly like dissect this goal of ascension and how it's used to create meaning inside of our lives when so much of what I channel comes through as the meaning is the experience without
Yeah.
any desire for anything more. And yet here we are all talking about this one thing that we're all supposed to be working towards, which completely contradicts that entire paradigm. And how that could be playing into this patriarchal way of looking at the world where we have to fix and change what we perceive to be problems in order to feel better inside of who we are in the process and applying it in a spiritual context without really realizing that that's what's happening because there's something oddly scary about removing an external goal and not having one.
Mm-hmm.
When I channel beings of light, what always comes through consistently is that the purpose in being here is to experience being here. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, inside the spiritual space, there's all this talk about ascension, and that's the purpose. That's the goal, is to ascend. And that kind of gives the spiritual people meaning and purpose, is this
Mm-hmm.
thing to work towards. And they contradict each other because I think that there's something oddly scary about removing ascension as our purpose, because without it, there's this greater sense of meaninglessness. And I think this identity is also removed as well
Mhm.
inside of the light worker, the channeler, the healer. And that's also very unsettling too.
Yeah. Yeah. Both of those experiences are really uncomfortable. One having a positive meaning that we can throw on to negative or painful things to try to put a more palatable spin on them. That's painful. And then also the painful removal of our identity as someone who is working on achieving something, which is the ego. Anytime that we have an identity or a purpose or a meaning taken away from us, it's removing a layer of ego because everything ego related is getting from where we are to somewhere else, getting somewhere other than now. And that's also painful, but only because that is forcing a aspect of you to die. It can't exist without that anymore.
How do you come to terms then with kind of meshing the two together, where if we're coming here to experience being here, how do I also create change that I want to experience and know that it's not necessarily my purpose in being here, and that it's also okay if I can't when it feels like that's what's desired? Like the difference between being and doing, and the need without needing, and the desire without desiring. Am I making any sense?
I think so, but I would prefer if you answered your own question.
I don't know if I have an answer, and I think that's the dance that we come here to play,
Yeah.
which is that from the soul perspective, there you're here to just be. And from the human perspective, being is massively uncomfortable, so we're always looking for something to do. And learning to play the dance between doobie 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 do
Yeah.
is sort of the experience of this physical reality. But if you can also consciously be aware of why you're doing what you're doing and how you're wanting to feel inside of what you're doing, that's where your power comes from. And that's where this willingness to see a different perspective, to access a different feeling comes in. For me, coming back to our original question, which is there are two ways to find peace, right?
Mhm.
You can find peace by changing your external reality and trying to control it, or um, fix what you're seeing, or get other people to do things differently so that you're witnessing more of a sense of harmony, is one way of going about it. Another way of going about it is having the willingness to change your perspective of what you're seeing so that you can access a different feeling internally. And ultimately, there is no right and there is no wrong. There is just your choice, and you can choose it consciously, or you can fall into an unconscious pattern of operating. But I think that that is the dance between the soul self and the human perspective, ultimately. And the ascension process is about becoming conscious of that dance and finding your flow inside of it, and knowing that regardless of what you choose, regardless of the experience you're having, and regardless of the outcome, it's all going to be okay. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I would love your feedback on this. If you have any perspectives on this that we haven't touched on, and we'll see you next week.